Our Bible word is John 10, verse 16. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. So, here we have Jesus. He's in Jerusalem, and he's at this stage still at the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles, it was an agricultural feast. The ingathering of the harvest was celebrated, but it also became associated with like the Exodus and the people leaving Egypt. But Jesus was here, and towards the end of the feast, it says in chapter 7, it was now the last day of the feast. He encountered a man that was born blind. And then Jesus, with the help of saliva, put mud on this man's eyes, and he told him, "Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." And the man came back and he could see, and now there was this big uproar because Jesus healed him. And the Pharisees also questioned this man, saying, "Who is this man who healed you?" So he says, "I don't know who it was." And they also say, "This man cannot be a man of God. He's a sinner. He works on the Sabbath," etc. And then this man also says, "Well, I don't know if he's a man of God, but can a man of God do these miracles that he can do?" And the religious leaders also question this man's parents. Was he really born blind? So these parents say, "Well, you ask our son, him yourself. He's of age now. He can speak for himself." And eventually, the Pharisees supposedly kicked him out of the synagogue. So this man who was healed by Jesus, who now he couldn't attend the synagogue anymore. And of course, this also symbolized the later community of John, where Jewish believers were all expelled from the synagogue because of their faith in Jesus. But anyhow, at a later stage, Jesus encounters this man and he asks him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" So the blind man, or the man who was healed now, he says, "Well, show him to me and I'll believe in him." And Jesus says, "I am he." And then Jesus also makes this pronouncement. Because remember, this man was blind. Jesus healed him. He has come to sight. But more than that, he's come to have spiritual insight. He can see with spiritual eyes because now he recognizes Jesus and he believes in Jesus as the Son of God. And that's contrasted with those who can see, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, but they are blind because they don't recognize who Jesus is. Now, Jesus contrasts these two groups. If we go to chapter 9, verses 39, Jesus says, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." So Jesus is saying in an indirect way, the Pharisees, those who questioned this man who was healed, who put him under pressure, who expelled him from the synagogue, they are blind. And Jesus also then goes on to compare them with being false shepherds. Now, in our context, this was the last day of the feast, or the Feast of Tabernacles, and that's the Feast of Tabernacles, that's chapter 7 to 8, and then that happened around September, October of the year. Chapter 9 is where Jesus heals the blind man. That's also during this time of Tabernacles, specifically the last day of that time period. But our interaction here in John 10, or what Jesus says in John 10, also points forward to the Feast of Hanukkah that we find in chapter 10 of John. And Hanukkah happened in December. So we hear around September, October still, but it anticipates the Feast of Hanukkah that will happen in December, which comes later in John, specifically John 22, John 10 verses 22. And the Feast of Hanukkah is also known as a festival of lights, or the Feast of Dedication. And this celebrated the rededication of the temple by Judas Maccabee in 164 BC. Because after its desecration by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, this was a Greek ruler. He persecuted the Jewish people. They couldn't circumcise their sons at a stage. He burnt copies of the Torah. They erected pagan altars at the temple. They even sacrificed pigs at the temple in Jerusalem. And much of this was done with the support and help of priests in Jerusalem. So, of course, the Maccabees, they stood up. There was the Maccabean revolt. And then they chased away the Greeks from Jerusalem, and they got rid of those priests who introduced this false worship into the temple. And the temple was cleansed and purified and rededicated in 164 BC. And this is the Hanukkah, or also known as the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of Dedication. This is not a biblical feast, but from this time it was an annual feast for Jews where they remember where the temple was purified of this pagan worship. So now Jesus is here on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, but what is happening here in chapter 10 also anticipates and looks forward to the rest of chapter 10, where the Feast of Hanukkah will take place. Because this Feast of Hanukkah, because it's about the rededication and those false priests that were chased away from the temple, the Hanukkah liturgy went on about God will getting rid of or speaking about false shepherds. And that the background to this also is Ezekiel chapter 34. So go read Ezekiel chapter 34. God, they criticizes the false shepherds. They devour and eat the sheep, so to speak. They only look after their own interests. And that type of language also became relevant to the Feast of Hanukkah, because there were also these false shepherds at that time, around 167, 168 BC, where the other false priests, these false shepherds, introduced pagan worship. So that's the background, that's the language of Jesus, because Jesus comes here and he also speaks of the Pharisees and the other religious leaders. You are false shepherds. You lead the people astray, and also you devour them, because they devoured this blind man, so to speak. They oppressed him, they persecuted him, they come after him because he came to believe in Jesus. So they are false shepherds, and Jesus contrasts them with himself, because in this chapter 10, Jesus says, I am the door of the sheep. Because that's quite a common thing in this time, is there would be these pens that in the field or maybe in the villages where the sheep would return to at night, and then the shepherd would sleep across the opening, so to protect the sheep so that wild animals won't come in. So Jesus says there, I am the door of the sheep. In other words, he's their protector, but also he's the one who leads them out to pasture. They recognize his voice. They follow Jesus. And he also knows his sheep by name. So this typical imagery of relationship between a shepherd and the sheep that existed at this time. And compared to this, Jesus compares the Pharisees. They are thieves and robbers. They're not interested in the well-being of the sheep. If they come there to the sheep, it's to destroy or to steal them. Jesus also says later on, I am the good shepherd. And what does the good shepherd do? If we go to verses 15, it says, as the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. So compared to these false shepherds who steal the sheep, who oppress them, and also Jesus also refers them to hirelings. They're there just to do a job. They don't really care for the sheep, because if the predator comes, they run away, etc. Jesus says, I am here. I'm the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I look after the sheep. And specifically, Jesus lays down his life for the sheep. Pharisees, other religious leaders, they exploit the sheep, or they don't care really for the sheep. compared to what Jesus does. And then we come to our Bible word, verse 16. And other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. So Jesus says, I am the door of the sheep. Also, I am the good shepherd. He's the one who lays down his life for the sheep. And there's also other sheep. That can refer to other Jews, Gentiles, people who are not yet part of the church. Jesus says they must also become part of this fold. Because where Jesus is the good shepherd. Here they find pasture. Here they will follow Jesus. He protects them. He cares for them deeply because he gives his life for the sheep. In contrast to these hirelings or these false shepherds, Jesus likens these Pharisees, like I said, to the time of the Maccabean time or the Maccabean revolt, when the priests of that time, they introduced pagan worship into the temple. Of course, that language draws from Ezekiel 34, where Ezekiel 34, around the time of the Babylonian exile, God also criticizes the false shepherds that caused the scattering of the sheep. In other words, the exile. Those are the false shepherds. They don't care for the sheep. They exploit them. They devour them, etc. Go read Ezekiel 34. Because that type of language became part of the Hanukkah liturgy, where Jesus is also here, or our pericope here is relevant, where Jesus compares himself, being the good shepherd, to these false shepherds, those religious leaders who mislead the people of Israel.